London, in the late summer of 1939, was a city caught between routine and fear. The familiar hum of buses and markets was already shadowed by the prospect of air raids. Officials assured the public that a plan existed to protect the most vulnerable, and in particular, the children. That plan was evacuation, a movement from the city toward what was described as safety in the countryside. On the surface, it looked like a humanitarian effort, shaped by the urgency of war. Yet in monochrome images, preserved from the time, the story is less straightforward. The photographs show children in plain coats, waiting on crowded train platforms, holding paper tags and small cases. Some appear calm, others uncertain. The visual motif of file stamps, folded memoranda, and uniform lapels surfaces again and again, hinting at the bureaucratic machinery behind the human journey. Archival papers and official notices suggested one intention, while small inconsistencies in dates and annotations point to the possibility of different motives. Was the operation primarily about protection, or could it also have served the needs of administration and resource management? This series examines the evacuation through those fragments, contrasting official accounts with what the evidence suggests. The tone is not of final judgment, but of quiet inquiry. Each chapter will move from the crowded platforms of London to the reception in rural surroundings, to the institutions that shape the rules, to the private strain behind public narratives, and finally to the ways memory and record interact today. The images remain black and white, and the questions continue to echo across the years. Chapter 1. Children gather at the platforms. The first days of September 1939 brought Londoners to crowded train platforms that would soon be remembered in countless photographs and recollections. Rows of children in plain coats stood in uneven lines, many clutching small cardboard cases or simple bags. Paper tags were pinned to their clothing, and sandwiches wrapped in paper were often held tightly in one hand. Black and white images capture these moments with striking clarity, showing both the formal order imposed by officials in uniform and the nervous gestures of siblings holding each other close. Parents were frequently present at the edge of the crowd, their faces tense as they waved or stood silently, knowing the separation might last far longer than anyone admitted at the time. The official explanation, repeated in clipped newspaper, headlines and public notices, was that the evacuation would remove children from danger. Yet some details hint at more complex motives. Certain memoranda appear to have been prepared days before the official announcement, suggesting the operation was as much about controlling population flow as it was about safety. A file stamp on one document predates the first mass departures, while another record shows the same date altered in 2 inks. Such indicators may point to a plan that prioritized administrative convenience as much as child protection. The atmosphere at the platforms was one of ritualized departure rather than spontaneous escape. Loudspeakers called groups forward in neat order, while clerks in plain uniforms checked off names against long lists. The black and white frame lingers on the folded papers they held, papers that seem as significant to the process as the children themselves. For many of those watching, the evacuation may have seemed both reassuring and deeply unsettling. It reassured because the government appeared to act decisively. It unsettled because the movement of so many children revealed the scale of the threat more starkly than any newspaper column. The sense of urgency, underscored by repeated headlines displayed near the platforms, created an impression of national unity. Yet behind this unity lay unanswered questions. Were families being given full information about where their children were going, or were they expected to trust in a process that appeared more bureaucratic than personal? The wide shots of departing trains and the close-ups of children staring from carriage windows capture this tension. The repeated motif of uniform lapels and stamped documents highlights the mixture of official oversight and private emotion that defined those days. As the trains pulled away, the crowds remained on the platforms, smaller, quieter, and perhaps more aware of how fragile the idea of safety had become. This departure was presented as temporary, but the document suggests that authorities anticipated a much longer separation. Whether the evacuation was first and foremost about the safety of children, or whether it was equally a strategy to manage urban populations during wartime, remains uncertain. The images do not provide answers, but they open space for reflection. The story now turns to the countryside, where the reality of reception did not always match the promises printed in official notices, and where the presence of these evacuees began to reshape both the rural communities and the children themselves. Chapter 2: Reception in Unfamiliar. Rural houses, children arrived in small groups along country lanes, stepping from buses into quiet, unfamiliar streets. Hosts waited with measured reserve and practical caution, their clothes tidy and plain. A recurring visual motif is evident here, a file stamp on a folded memorandum kept in a pocket. Placement often began with a handshake, a quick glance at a paper, and a settling into rooms not originally their own. Many children wore plain coats and carried small cases that smelled faintly of home. They were shown to spare beds or settled at kitchen tables under polite, sometimes distant supervision. Local children watched from hedgerows or schoolyard edges, curious and cautious. Daily life shifted quickly, with new routines forming around school bells, mealtimes, and chores. The formal language of placement forms accompanied these changes, and the documents seemed to map lives as much as addresses. Officials presented the reception as an arrangement for safety and continuity. This public account may emphasize protection and temporary care as the central aims. Yet the documents occasionally suggest other priorities. Annotations in the margins of placement forms sometimes indicate occupational categories, beyond mere family size or available beds. A revised reference number appears on a typed sheet, suggesting administrative reshuffling. Such indicators may point to selection criteria that considered capacity for domestic or agricultural work. Hosts and householders sometimes described children as additions to family routines, useful hands during busy seasons. For some families, this meant sharing resources and affection. For others, it meant hidden expectations and unspoken bargains. The rural landscape itself shaped these interactions, with isolated lanes, parish halls, and schoolrooms forming a new social architecture. In many villages, the presence of evacuees altered the rhythm of daily commerce, schooling, and social life. Local teachers adapted lessons to manage larger classes. Shopkeepers adjusted supplies to meet different needs. Parish registers and school ledgers began to note unfamiliar surnames beside older entries, and these small records carried weight. The pattern of integration was uneven across parishes, sometimes warm, sometimes wary. Local leaders offered guidance through notices and bulletins pinned in public places. These notices often used the same language found on official papers, language that reassured and organized simultaneously. Yet families soon learned that formal assurances did not always translate into lived kindness. Children reported differing. Receptions, from a warm mattress and a shared supper, to practical bargains about labor in return for shelter. The social consequences were immediate and human. Friendships formed slowly, often across a gulf of habit and class. Some children adopted local speech and customs quickly. Others remained guarded, retaining city habits and cautious glances at rural weather. Teachers and clergymen recorded changing attendance and behavior in diaries that later became part of public archives. Those diaries sometimes bore pen marks and edited entries that indicate later revision. Community meetings debated schooling, rationing, and whether evacuees should return to the city after danger passed. Decisions were portrayed as temporary measures, yet many households treated placements as longer term. Children adapted in practical ways, learning new chores and adjusting to new diets. Meals changed from packed sandwiches to boiled vegetables and puddings cooked on domestic stoves. Clothes were patched and reissued, uniforms appearing among local attires for some older children. The visual contrast between a plain civilian coat and a formal hosting apron recurs across photographs. These images suggest regulation mixed with improvisation. Local economies were affected in subtle ways, sometimes easing labor shortages during harvests. At other times, they created resentment among households unable to absorb added mouths. The moral tone of village records varies between gratitude and complaint. Church bulletins praised collective effort, while private notes recorded tension and fatigue. Public stories emphasized national spirit and the care of children as a patriotic duty. Private letters, when preserved, often suggest quieter realities: exhaustion, financial pressure, and homesickness. The policy framework guiding reception was communicated through directives and circulars that filtered down from distant offices. Local committees implemented these directives in ways that fit local conditions. Some committees prioritized matching children to families by need and temperament. Others relied on whoever offered space first. Placement lists sometimes bear changes, where names were moved between columns. These changes suggest last-minute adjustments and pragmatic choices. A margin note on one list records a reassignment described tersely, without explanation. Such archival details imply an operation that could be responsive but also improvised under strain. The presence of clerks and officials at train platforms was mirrored by parish clerks and teachers managing arrivals in village halls. Their roles involved paperwork and pastoral oversight in equal measure. They recorded names, assessed sleeping arrangements, and provided basic instructions about meals and curfews. These same people kept copies of ledgers and sometimes added handwritten comments. Those comments, when read later, hint at differing interpretations of policy and practice. For children, the experience of reception was intensely personal and sensory. They remembered the smell of peat fires, the solidity of heavy doors, and the sudden quiet after London traffic. Many recalled the kindness of some hosts and the strictness of others. Some found safety and affection. Others found discipline and work. The scale of movement made individual stories difficult to generalize. The photographic record captures a range of expressions, from smiles to guarded, silent stances. Wide crowd shots show many arrivals, while close-up portraits emphasize solitary faces. Mid-shots of documents on tables anchor these human scenes to administrative processes. The recurring motifs of a file stamp, a folded memorandum, and a uniform lapel knit together the administrative and the intimate. These motifs suggest that reception was at once a humanitarian project and an administrative operation. Over time, patterns emerged that affected long-term outcomes. Children who settled quickly often accessed better schooling and social networks. Those who experienced tension sometimes bore emotional scars that lasted into adult life. Families that welcomed evacuees sometimes formed strong, lifelong bonds. Others never fully integrated these temporary additions. Community memory preserved both gratitude and grievance in oral histories collected later. National narratives emphasized a story of shared sacrifice and mutual care. Local records and personal letters sometimes nuance that account with quieter observations of hardship and compromise. The reception phase thus becomes a mirror for wider questions about policy, intent, and consequence. It shows how collective decisions intersect with private lives in ways that are complicated and morally ambiguous. As this chapter closes, the images of children stepping into rural houses and standing beneath hedgerows invite closer scrutiny of the rules written into paperwork. The next inquiry turns inward to the offices and ledgers where placement, oversight, and the language of policy took shape, and where the formal record would shape memory for decades to come. Chapter 3. Rules written into paperwork. Inside dim office rooms, rows of folders rested under low lighting and quiet. Clerks in plain uniforms moved between desks, carrying folded memoranda and long lists. The visual motif of a file stamp reappeared on nearly every page. Paperwork tracked names, addresses, and brief notes on disposition. Forms were typed and recopied for transmission across departments. Many sentences on those pages were short, direct, and almost bureaucratic in tone. Policies were expressed as directives, written to be clear and enforceable across varied locales. The language of policy often framed evacuation as a protective measure for children. That framing seems plausible when read with public notices and newspaper reproductions. Yet the very structure of the documents also suggests administrative priorities. Columns of data and categories created a logic oriented to allocation and capacity. The ledger format might have influenced choices more than individual circumstances. Handwritten margin notes occasionally adjusted entries, and the pattern of those notes implies negotiation rather than simple recording. Clerical corrections sometimes indicate last-minute reassignment or recategorization. One archive sheet bears a stamped date that conflicts with a later docket entry, hinting at retroactive adjustments. A second ledger shows a revised reference number scrawled in ink, suggesting administrative reshuffling. These two archival markers are subtle, but they appear across multiple collections and invite close reading. The physicality of the documents shape decisions in practical ways. Assigned instruction could authorize placement in one district and require a different record in another. The same page could move from desk to desk, gaining annotations and marginalia that adjusted meaning. Officials at different levels read the same document with varying priorities. For some, the main concern was child safety and continuity of schooling. For others, the dominant aim appears to have been managing flows of people and resources within wartime economies. The wording of circulars sometimes emphasized temporary displacement. That language may have reassured parents and local hosts, but the cadence of instructions also standardized timeframes and conditions of care. Forms set expectations about sleeping arrangements, dietary needs, and schooling. They normalized certain trade-offs as acceptable in the name of national necessity. The process of filling and refilling these forms created a chain of custody for decisions about children's daily lives. Each signature and each file stamp effectively authorized changes that affected where a child slept and whom they would live with. That fact gave written records a power separate from the human relationships involved. In practice, local committees translated the forms into action. Minutes from such meetings show debate over matching children with available beds. Sometimes these debates focused on temperament and age. Other times they focused on what households could physically sustain. Such distinctions seem small in official prose, but they carried real weight for families and children. The record also reveals uneven treatment. Some placement forms contain careful notes about preferences and needs. Other forms reduce children to brief identifiers and an assigned parish. These inconsistencies may reflect local capacity and the pressures of scale. The speed of movement required clerks to make practical judgments in real time. Postal and telegraph records show bursts of activity coinciding with mass departures. That correspondence sometimes closed gaps in information, but it also produced additional shorthand language. Over time, that shorthand became institutional practice. Documents then circulated with assumed meanings, understood by clerks and officials across departments. Such conventions might streamline operations, but they can also obscure individual circumstances. The effect is a paperwork culture that shapes stories as much as it records them. The materiality of paper itself affected outcomes. Some forms were lost or misfiled. Others were damaged by damp or time. Where records survived, they sometimes bear visible corrections and striking through lines. Those marks indicate human choice in the act of record keeping. In a few cases, a single altered entry changed a child's placement or return date. The possibility of such changes introduces ambiguity into official accounts. The textual record, therefore, becomes both a source and a subject of inquiry. It supplies evidence of process while also carrying traces of decision-making that may not have been fully transparent. Where paperwork reveals careful attention, it can support narratives of protection. Where paperwork reveals hurried annotations and shifted numbers, it can suggest practical compromises and administrative priorities. The difference is not necessarily conspiratorial. It often reflects the tension between scale and care when institutions manage thousands of lives at once. The way forms described assumptions about family composition and capacity also mattered. Questionnaires asked about number of siblings and existing household members. They rarely captured emotional bonds or particular vulnerabilities. A child with a chronic worry or a learning difficulty might be reduced to a tick box on a form. That reduction shaped the kind of attention they received in a new household. School reports and medical notes sometimes traveled with placement documents, but not always. Gaps in transmission could leave receiving households without crucial information. That absence could produce mismatches between needs and capacity on both sides. The archival record suggests patterns in which children with no recorded special needs were moved more frequently than others. That pattern may indicate a preference for simpler cases under pressure. It also raises questions about how institutions weighed complexity when managing large-scale movements. The procedural language used in directives appears designed to minimize discretionary variation. Yet marginal annotations and rewrites show how discretion persisted at local levels. Some clerks wrote brief justifications for reassignments. Others left notes that simply recorded an outcome without explanation. Those differences affect how historians read the evidence. The paperwork thus invites careful attention to both what is present and what is omitted. At a human level, the consequences were tangible. Family units were disrupted. Bonds were stretched across letters and occasional visits. The paperwork that authorized separation also governed contact and return. Records sometimes specified conditions for visits or communication. Other times they remained silent, leaving families to negotiate access informally. That silence could exacerbate anxiety for parents and children alike. Over months and years, administrative language shaped the rhythm of reunion and memory. As files accumulated, they became part of institutional memory. Later reviews and inquiries drew on these same documents. The way records were kept and revised influenced later assessments of success and failure. Retrospective reports often referenced the same stamped sheets and marginal notes. Those references could support narratives of efficiency or, alternatively, narratives of oversight and unintended consequence. The documents themselves cannot resolve all questions. They are products of their time, reflecting both the intentions and the constraints of those who wrote them. Yet they remain vital for understanding how policy and practice intersected in the lives of children. The visual motifs that connect paperwork to the human scenes, file stamp, folded memorandum, uniform, lapel, keep reappearing across archives and photographs. Those motifs remind us that decisions traveled from offices to platforms and into rural homes. The evidence suggests complex motives and mixed effects rather than single, neat explanations. The next chapter will examine how these formal records translated into private experience and how separation and reception left quieter marks on families long after official notices were archived. Chapter 4. Private Strain. Behind public narratives, homes and schoolyards show another side of the evacuation story, one less obvious in public statements and more intimate in lived detail. Children in plain coats stood slightly apart from local peers, often holding possessions that smelled of home. Close-up portraits from the time reveal guarded eyes and small smiles that do not quite reach the face. The recurring motif of a folded memorandum appears in household drawers beside letters from city parents. Family meals changed in tone and composition when new children sat at the table. Daily routines rearranged themselves around curfews, chores, and unfamiliar house rules. The public narrative emphasized national unity and shared sacrifice, and that language may have helped communities accept disruption without open complaint. Yet private letters and journal entries often reflect strain that the public story did not fully acknowledge. A parent's letter might describe quiet nights spent waiting for a reply. A child's homework might list new chores alongside class assignments. Teachers noted shifts in attendance and attention that seemed to correlate with changed sleeping arrangements. The visual record alternates between wide shots of schoolyards and intimate mid-shots of kitchen tables. These images show both the communal performance of care and the quieter intimacies of distance and longing. The formal language of reports and circulars tends to smooth over personal details. That smoothing can obscure difficult adjustments that were largely invisible to officials. While circulars emphasize temporary measures, local diaries reveal extended separations that affected family dynamics for months or years. Practical demands often shaped emotional outcomes. Some households provided warm welcome and steady routines. Others expected practical contribution in return for food and shelter. Tasks such as washing, dishwork, and simple farm labor sometimes became regular parts of a child's day. Where those tasks were framed as part of school or domestic training, they could be presented as beneficial. Where they were framed as unpaid labor, the same tasks felt more like exploitation to the child and their parents. The difference often depended on local conditions and the attitudes of hosts rather than on any central rule. Social stigma could also emerge. Local children sometimes treated evacuees as newcomers to be tested. Labels and slang attached themselves quickly, and they often persisted long after the war. Schoolyard hierarchies adjusted to include new groups, and teachers sometimes reported conflicts that needed mediation. Such frictions contributed to a sense of otherness that many evacuees carried into adulthood. Letters and personal papers reveal how children negotiated identity in two places at once. Some learned new accents and school songs, adopting local rhythms rapidly. Others maintained city habits, resisting assimilation while sustaining bonds through correspondence. The exchange of letters became a lifeline for many families. Postal bundles arrived with parcels, sweets, and printed notices. The file stamp on a returned parental letter occasionally shows a date inconsistent with other entries, indicating delays or misrouting. Those delays could deepen anxiety and prolong separation. In some archives, a folded memorandum bears a revised reference number, a small administrative change that later affected access to visits. Such indicators emphasize how paperwork could shape personal experience. The presence or absence of a single note in the margin sometimes altered a child's prospects for return or for regular contact. For many parents, the lack of clear information became a source of persistent worry. Day-to-day life for children often hinged on small material comforts. A patched coat, a warm blanket, or a favored biscuit could matter greatly. Photos show children warming hands over stoves, eyes fixed on plates, and hands fidgeting with buttons. The visual language of monochrome frames captures texture and gesture more than color. That focus on form amplifies small signs of comfort or distress. Private records include stories of makeshift celebrations, quiet kindnesses, and unsent essays tucked into school books. They also include accounts of harsh discipline and abrupt decisions. Clerical notes sometimes record reassignments without explanation, and families were left to interpret the consequences. These ambiguities shaped how memories formed. Over time, recollections diverged between public narratives and private memories. Official histories often highlight outcomes and collective effort. Personal memoirs underline the costs borne by individuals and families. Both forms of record are partial. Where public records emphasize scale and order, private documents emphasize texture and consequence. They complement rather than contradict each other when read together carefully. Many adults who experienced evacuation recall being caught between gratitude and resentment. They remember kindnesses alongside losses. They remember teachers who helped and hosts who were indifferent. Those mixed memories complicate simple stories of rescue and unity. The psychological effects were varied. Some children exhibited resilience and adaptation. Others experienced ongoing anxiety about belonging and identity. Educators later pointed to disrupted schooling and social discontinuity as factors in lifelong patterns of behavior and career choice for some evacuees. Community bonds sometimes hardened as a result of shared struggle. Other times, divisions deepened along social and economic lines. Gendered expectations also shaped experience. Boys and girls were sometimes assigned different tasks and responsibilities that reflected local norms. Clothing and appearance became signals of origin and status. A plain civilian coat could mark a child as an evacuee in a new community. Uniform lapels and school blazers distinguished local pupils from newcomers in some photographs. Those visual cues affected social reception on playgrounds and in classrooms. The recirculation of children between homes and city visits further complicated relationships. Return visits sparked joy and anxiety in equal measure. Families adjusted to tentative reunions and then to renewed separations when policy shifted again. The rhythm of partial returns created patterns of attachment that were episodic rather than continuous. Over months and years, some family ties frayed while others deepened profoundly. This private strain was not only emotional, it carried practical consequences for health, education, and economic standing. Missed schooling sometimes delayed academic progress. Interrupted family support networks could strain household economies when parents returned to work. Some households reported lasting effects on marriage and parenting patterns that persisted into post-war life. Local institutions such as churches, schools, and municipal committees played roles that were both supportive and regulatory. These bodies often acted as intermediaries between the formal policy expressed in circulars and the private realities of households. Their minutes and records reveal interventions and occasional disputes. A parish council might advocate for more visits. A school log might record behavioral issues requiring attention. Such entries show how public administration filtered into private consequences. The motif of a folded memorandum recurs in these records, linking higher-level decisions to lived consequences on the ground. The tension between the official narrative of protection and the private reality of strain remains a central question. Reading personal letters alongside circulars and ledgers offers a fuller, more ambiguous account. It suggests that the evacuation might have been protective and disruptive at once. The images of close-up faces and domestic interiors anchor this ambiguity in human experience. As these private stories accumulate, they lead to new questions about how memory and the written record have been shaped. The next chapter will track how those memories entered archives, how records were curated, and how public narratives consolidated around selected fragments of the past. Chapter 5: Memory and the Written Record. Decades. After the initial departures, black and white photographs and faded ledgers began to shape public remembrance. Archives gathered papers, letters, and school reports into neat collections with tidy labels. A recurring visual motif remained visible, a file stamp curled on the corner of a page. Photographs were often arranged with care, showing train platforms, uniform lapels, and close-up portraits of uncertain faces. Oral testimonies arrived later than official circulars, offered by adults who remembered childhood confusion. Memory and documents thus met unevenly in time and tone. Personal letters described smells, small comforts, and rupture with plain language. Institutional records kept lists, signatures, and official dates in a more formal register. These two forms of evidence did not align neatly in every case. The archive shows this tension in small, telling ways. A cover sheet in one folder bears a stamped date inconsistent with internal notes. A later reference number appears retrofitted to earlier papers, suggesting retrospective editing or administrative reordering. These indicators do not imply malice. They do imply selective preservation and practical record-keeping under pressure. Curators often chose what to keep based on perceived public interest. Families retained letters that mattered most to them, discarding other fragments. Public institutions sometimes retained summary reports and discarded raw field notes. The result is a documentary record shaped by choices at many levels. That shaping affected how future readers would understand the evacuation. In public narratives, emphasis fell on scale and civic cohesion. Books and broadcasts highlighted the movement as a national act of protection and resilience. This framing may have served immediate social needs by fostering unity. It may also have simplified complex individual experiences into a single, reassuring story. Oral histories complicate that account with texture and contradiction. Interviewed decades later, former evacuees recalled kindness and neglect in equal measure. They remembered hosts who offered warmth and hosts who expected labor in return. Those memories often carried a mixture of gratitude and lingering grievance. Teachers and local officials contributed additional perspectives through diaries and school logs. These documents sometimes recorded behavioral shifts, attendance patterns, and the practicalities of integration. Such notes may indicate the institutional burdens created by mass placement. They may also reveal acts of individual care that official reports did not emphasize. The interplay of document and memory shows how public narratives can emphasize certain facts while leaving others in shadow. For instance, official summaries stress logistical success and low casualty figures. Personal letters and diaries dwell on longing, missing routines, and disrupted education. The differences are not contradictory, so much as complementary. Together they sketch a fuller and more ambiguous portrait. The archival process itself altered perceptions. Papers that survived often bore marks of repeated handling, folded memoranda, penciled margin notes, and occasional corrections. Those marks can suggest ongoing negotiation about interpretation. A clerk's italicized note might explain a reassignment. A marginal comment might record a later complaint from a parent. Over time, such marginalia could be incorporated into more authoritative narratives. Replay and reproduction in newspapers and broadcasts gave selected documents amplified reach. The choice to reproduce certain photographs and reports shaped collective memory. Editors prioritized images that conveyed a tidy drama, orderly cues, smiling children, and contented hosts. Less photogenic material, tired faces, cramped bedrooms, ambiguous correspondence, received less attention. The imbalance influenced public understanding of what the evacuation was like. Memory also travels through education and ceremonies. School programs and community exhibitions in later decades framed evacuation in terms of national sacrifice. Commemorative programs often presented the event within a familiar script of unity and perseverance. That script may have helped successive generations identify with wartime endurance. It may also have smoothed over complex social realities that included class tension and uneven care. Scholars and family historians later mined the archives for nuance. They compared ledgers and personal letters to paint more complicated pictures. Such work revealed patterns of reassignment, gaps in schooling, and the varying quality of reception. It also exposed the archival gaps left by lost or discarded papers. Some families kept slender scrapbooks of letters and ration coupons. Others preserved only a single photograph, the rest lost to routine disposal. The archive therefore privileges certain voices over others, depending on survival. That skew can affect how historians generalize from available sources. Public memory often crystallizes around a few vivid images. Those images can become symbolic shorthand for the entire experience. Symbols are useful for communal meaning-making. They are also limited as historical evidence. The black and white motif of train platforms and file stamps can compress many different realities into a single frame. Careful study must resist that compression. It must attend to anomalies, to marginal notes, and to inconsistent dates. Such anomalies often point to interim practices and pragmatic compromises. For example, a stamped date that conflicts with internal notes may indicate rushed decisions during peak movement. A retrofitted reference number may indicate later administrative consolidation. These matters of paperwork reflect the pressures of scale rather than the purity of intent. They are also useful lines of evidence for understanding policy in practice. Memory studies have shown how personal recollection reshapes events over time. Narratives told and retold can emphasize different elements depending on context. Some former evacuees foregrounded kindness in stories told to family. Others emphasized hardship when recounting formative experiences in memoirs. The variability of personal testimony requires careful cross-referencing with documentary evidence. When done well, such cross-referencing reveals both consistent motifs and surprising divergences. It highlights how people lived with the policy and remembered it later. The public record and private memory can therefore be read together to show layered truths. This reading suggests that evacuation was protective in many instances. It also suggests that administrative convenience, local resources, and social expectations shaped outcomes differently across regions. Memory and the written record both contribute to this multifaceted conclusion. They also point toward unresolved questions. How did archival selection influence public commemoration? How did marginal notes inside folders change later interpretations? Which stories were amplified and which were permitted to fade? The surviving materials guide inquiry but do not determine final answers. The repeating visual motifs, file stamp, folded memorandum, uniform lapel, train platform, connect institutional processes to intimate experience. They remind us that records do not merely reflect the past, they participate in it. Reading them demands attention to both what is said and what is left unsaid. The next step in the series explores how these archival traces influence modern debates about care, displacement, and the ethics of managing vulnerable populations. It will also consider how present-day institutions interpret and sometimes replicate patterns seen in the past. Decades of reflection have made the evacuation an image of both care and complication. Archives hold neat ledgers, folded memoranda, and photocopies of clipped headlines. Oral letters and memoirs arrive later, adding texture to official summaries. Together, these materials form a patchwork that may clarify some questions and obscure others. The repeated motif of a file stamp links distant desks to kitchen tables. In many cases, inconsistent stamped dates or revised reference numbers suggest hurried decisions under pressure. Those small archival anomalies could indicate administrative reshaping rather than intentional concealment. Personal testimonies often emphasize daily details, such as patched coats, school books, and the taste of new meals. Institutional records tend toward scale, listing names, parishes, and dates in tidy columns. Reading both kinds of evidence side by side reveals patterns and important gaps. It shows where policy achieved protection and where it may have produced hardship. It suggests that administrative convenience sometimes intersected with genuine care. It also indicates how choices about what to keep shaped later understanding. Community memory preserves heroism and kindness alongside fatigue and quiet grievance. Educators, archivists, and families all played roles in forming those memories. Contemporary debates about displacement and child welfare may find precedence in these wartime practices. The archived paper trail, with its marginal notes and corrected entries, invites careful ethical interpretation. Future inquiry might compare these historical files to current policies on child movement and care. That work could highlight continuities in institutional decision-making and point toward better safeguards. The story remains open, framed by train platforms, uniform lapels, folded memoranda, and file stamps. It asks us to look again at how records are made, what is preserved, and what we owe to those who were moved.